This presentation is entitled The Hypotenuse, the Path to Peace. As you shall see, this assertion shall be explained here in a logical progression. The thesis of this work is that we humans, with the gift of a soul, may learn from recent advances regarding natural complexity in order to find peace and build a better world. As a reminder, here is a right triangle having legs A and B and a hypotenuse C, satisfying the celebrated Pythagorean theorem a squared plus b squared equals c squared. As is seen, this triangle has two equal legs, and if they are 1 unit long each, the hypotenuse would measure the square root of 2, which represents the shortest distance from the bottom left to the upper right. This is true despite our inability to know the precise meaning of the ... after 1.4142 due to its infinite irrational expansion. As you shall note, this talk contains a few simple games that illustrate how fragmentation happens. Here is the first one. This is a game for kids easily understood modeling clay. Drawn here is the bar of a clay as it comes out of the box. The game starts cutting the bar by a given factor, say 70% from the left, as shown by the vertical line. Then the game continues piling up the largest piece to the left and enlarging the second piece also to the left so that they make up two contiguous uniform bars with equal horizontal lengths. Clearly, the first piece is higher than the original bar and the second piece is lower. The game continues repeating the same process on each piece. At the next level, there are clearly 4 rectangles whose masses are 70% of 70% or 49%, 30% of 70% or 21%, 70% of 30% or the same 21%, and 30% of 30%, which gives 9%. Clearly, 49 plus 21 plus 21 plus 9 gives 100% in virtue of the well-known principle of conservation of modeling clay, something that does not work well if there are little kids at home. The next level contains 8 pieces, and the most massive rectangle continues to grow in height. As the base of such a rectangle is half of a half of a half, or 1/8, and as the area equals 0.7 cubed, the height gives 1.4 cubed, which is 2.74 times higher than the height of the original bar. What the game produces may be calculated easily for arbitrary partitions P and Q. At the first level of the game, beneath the initial bar, the masses are precisely P and Q. At the second level, one finds, in order, P of P, or P squared, Q of P, P of Q, and Q squared, which is no more than the familiar expression of P plus Q all squared. At the next level, one gets P plus Q all cubed, for the masses from level to level are found just multiplying. As may be noted, all is related to the famous Pascal's triangle and the binomial theorem, and the game defines a properly named multiplicative cascade. Here is what happens after repeating the game 12 times, that is, n equal to 12. We obtain 2 to the 12 rectangles with very small bases, and the original bar is broken into many thorns, which prick us if we touch them from above. As the vertical scale increases dramatically due to the successive pileups, the diagram that would have been 1.4 to the 12, equal to 56.69 units in height, is compressed here so that it may fit on the page. As is seen, the thorns are ordered in layers according to Pascal's triangle. The highest thorn occurs once and contains P to the 12 of the mass. The smallest rectangle on the right happens also once and is almost invisible as it has only Q to the 12 of the mass. Then the object has 12 large thorns with masses P to the 11 Q, 12 small thorns almost invisible with P Q to the 11, 66 thorns with P to the 10 Q squared, and so on. The layers are finely intertwined and increasing density as we enter into Pascal's triangle from both sides. Certainly, walking on this object is quite a challenge, for to visit someone at the same level of mass requires going up and down many times, as thorns for all layers tend to be separated by holes. If the same game is played many more times, the additional fragmentation gives rise to infinitely many thorns of infinite sizes that lack any cohesion whatsoever due to their sparseness. As such, the individual layers end up supported by a dispersed collection of points that is essentially dust, and the thorny object of this game is known as a multifractal. To fully appreciate the empty structure on every layer of the first game, it is pertinent to introduce another game for kids. This one is also played molding modeling clay, but instead of cutting the original bar by a value of p equals 70%, it is done by the middle, piling up left and right so that there is a hole of size 1/3 as shown. As before, this game progresses repeating the same idea, dividing each piece and piling up left and right with the same proportions. For each level, the process produces a collection of equally sized pieces that, by construction, never touch. Clearly, this simple game is another multiplicative cascade, eventually generating thorns of equal size emanating from a collection of points that, by being separated by gaps, are also essentially dust. By varying the size of the hole of the second game, say from 1/3 to an arbitrary size h, such would adjust the topological structure of layers in the first game. For example, while the denser layers require the propagation of smaller holes, those that are more dispersed correspond to larger holes. The morale is that the two games, although seemingly different, are at the end intimately related to one another. Both are divisive cascades, and the second lives inside the first on each of its layers. To further appreciate the games, and as they give rise to thorny objects containing nothing individually while growing to infinity, it is convenient to consider their accumulated masses from the beginning, 0, to a point x that varies from 0 to 1. Following the dynamics of the games, the two cascades on the left yield the accumulated objects shown on the right. For the first game, we obtain a cloud that contains a multitude of horizontal vertical notches. The most notorious one happens when x is equal to 1/2 and has a height of 0.7, as from the beginning to the middle of the object there is, by construction, 70% of the mass. There is a notch at x equal 1/4 with height 0.49, which is the aforementioned 70% of the mass, and so on. For the second game, we find a host of plateaus that correspond to the successive holes on the cascade. Clearly, the largest one happens from 1/3 to 2/3 and has a height of 1/2, as half of the mass was piled up to the left. There are then two plateaus with length 1/9 and heights 1/4 and 3/4, and so on. As is seen, the accumulated sets are mathematical monsters with many points where tangents cannot be defined. While the first profile has no derivatives at any point, the second one does not have them at the extremes of the plateaus. As there are notches and plateaus everywhere, both objects are locally flat, and their distances from bottom left to upper right are, at the end, equal to 2 units, one horizontal plus one vertical. It happens that such a property is universal. When imbalances P or holes H are propagated, such define thorns and dust that give rise to accumulated objects having maximum lengths of 2 units. The same happens when combining the games, and also when chance is used to define a general cascade with variable imbalances and holes from level to level. As the jagged profiles given by the cascades are locally flat everywhere, if one were to parachute on them, one would believe to have landed on flat ground. Because of this clear deception, and due to the fragmentation of the games, such profiles are appropriately known in physics and mathematics as devil's staircases. It happens that the first game for kids is related to the way turbulence happens in nature. When the inertia of a fluid, given by the product of the velocity and a characteristic length, subjugates the fluid cohesion, given by its viscosity, that is, when the Reynolds number Re, shown here on the right, is sufficiently large, the fluid breaks into an irreversible chain of eddies, which divide into more eddies, and so on. As reported by Charles Menneveau and Katepalli Srinivasan, those inwardly rotated elements carry with them unequal amounts of energy that correspond precisely to the layers of the first cascade, when the imbalance P is equally precisely to 70%. Inescapably, however, the energies in those eddies dissipate in the form of heat when the scale becomes sufficiently small. One-dimensional observations of fully developed turbulence, that is, a case without limiting boundaries, are consistent with the cascading breakings of eddies into a simple proportion. This holds universally for several flows, both in nature and in the laboratory, as appreciated by the inverted parabola below, for the simple cascade that closely matches observed layers and their densities when we enter Pascal's triangle from both sides. As the increasing entropy in turbulence happens universally via a simple cascade, common sense suggests we may employ such a process and the one defining the layers to study how we humans create our own turbulence. After all of us, from Afghanistan to Zimbabwe, are confronted by inertial forces that break our internal cohesion, and when such happens for sufficiently high Reynolds numbers, such produces our turbulent behaviors, ultimately leading to violence. For even if we want to deny it, many times we make mistakes repeating the same error again and again. In this spirit, while the first game may be used to vividly describe the proliferation of inequalities generated by our competitive and preferential instincts and leading to marked cynicism, the second cascade may be employed to represent the appalling effects of discriminations and the related distrust and fear that result while imposing equality by force. Note how these simple ideas and their associated diagrams properly reflect not only the political systems that have governed the world, but also our own selfish postures and actions. For they sadly express why the third world, made of 2/3 of the people in the world, that is 0.666 of all, live in poverty, while 6,000 kids die every day due to lack of water, and why we have been living for a really long time in an era of violence and terror. As history has proven that the second game does not work due to its conspicuous emptiness, it is relevant to ask, even if such a question is inadequate to some, if the globalization of the first cascade is the solution to the problems we all face. In this sense, it is useful to remember Pascal's triangle to perform some calculations. If the imbalance P is set at 70%, as in nature, and if n equal 20 levels of the cascade are considered, one may study where the modeling clay is located. As such, the 5, 10, 20, and 40% of the largest thorns contain in order 57, 70, 80, and 95% of the mass. Sadly, this adjusts the skewed wealth distribution of the most powerful nation on earth, the United States, by the end of the 20th century, circa 1998. For the richest there had, for the same percentiles, 59, 71, 84, and 95% of the resources. This is an undesired coincidence that provides, however, a truthful warning and a clear morale. If imbalances continue their propagation, as they appear to do in the 21st century, the laws of physics and common sense assures us that energy shall dissipate and we shall all bite the dust. This warning certainly applies not just for a single country, but to several others as well, as virtually any nation's wealth distribution may be adjusted via a multiplicative cascade. that gives a devil's staircase even if it requires variable partitions from level to level. Based on these reflections, we may see that there is a common sense code for peace, easily defined by the following imperatives: run the cascade in reverse to mend what is broken and achieve equilibrium. Live at low Reynolds numbers to avoid any violence and the anxieties of modern life. And to quote ancient prophets, cut mountains and fill valleys to restore unity. For both graphically and mathematically, unity is composed of infinitely many outward spirals that are opposed to the negative eddies induced by the diabolical power of the air, which also reflects a dusty false promise that misses the point. For it is the devil himself, the ruler of the power of the air, as well as the ruler of this world, who is, by his cascading division, our common enemy. He's the one who falsely whispers in our ears that death is inevitable and that brotherhood is an unachievable utopia in this world of which he is the prince of disorder. Based on these observations, we may see by ourselves that there is only one unique geometric solution which reflects the fact that we should not play divisive games. Clearly, the key is dynamically maintaining the original bar as it came out from the paradisiacal box of level 0, always practicing the proverbial 50-50 without exceptions, that is, without holes, and spiritually growing such that we fulfill the insuperable power of 0. For the uniform bar is the only straight and solid condition on which, by not containing thorns or dust, we may walk safely without fear. As we may see, this is essentially the way, the truth, and the life as defined by Jesus Christ, who, by never sinning or lying, always kept the essential plan of God's law and defeated dissipation. As the accumulation of the uniform bar results in the one-to-one line, again, Jesus Christ, and as such a ramp has a minimal distance of a square root of 2 from bottom left to top right, we may see why the hypotenuse of the triangle is indeed the path to peace, as it reflects unitive and radical love. For the wholesome truth travels efficiently with a slope of 1, while the divisive diabolical games produce devil's staircases as long as the legs of the same triangle. The moral is that we ought to always rectify if needed and love everyone as we have been told. For in the hypotenuse simple equation y equal to x, we may see once again a crucified silhouette of the one on a positive cross whose sacrifice represents the antidote of death. Although these connections may be surprising to some, there is a huge difference between devil's staircases and the key ramp. If we were to parachute on the hypotenuse, we would end up at the origin, consistently with Jesus' famous proclamation that nobody can arrive to the Father except through him. There is no other choice. It is impossible to slide by a devil's staircase, for it is locally flat. To emphasize the uniqueness of true equilibrium, here is the improbable point in the midst of a sea of possibilities, expressing all cascades that combine in balances P and holes H. As there are devil's staircases everywhere, we may know that it is hypocritical to judge others. And since the key point is merely a speck within a space, it is easier indeed for a camel to pass by the eye of a sufficiently large needle than to find the essential point. At the end, there is an appointed fateful algorithm guaranteeing our arrival to the point in spite of our selfishness, and it corresponds to repentance and rectification, which may be further appreciated noting that if the cascade is performed for only a finite number of levels, it produces a convex up surface from which we can move to the point of true balance just by recognizing the gravity of our faults. For there is a marked difference between the square root of 2 and 2, as there is between east and west, as there is between the divisive, negative, and selfish spiral of number 6 and the always loving, unitive, and positive of number 9, as there was darkness between such precise hours when Jesus died crowned by our multiple thorns. These ideas remind us, at the end, of our personal and collective options: equilibrium or turbulence, calmness or violence, rectitude or wickedness, 50-50 or inequities, the shortest or the longest, reconciliation or separation, integration and its slender S, or division and its negating symbol, for the love of money is the root of all evil. Wholeness or emptiness, unity and its outward spiral, or dust and the diabolical fraction, completeness or emptiness, and quite graphically, a positive outlook to the future or a negative attitude trapped in the past. So to end, I'd like to share a poem called Pathways. Two options before us, two pathways ahead. The one is the longest, the other is straight. We journey directly or go by the legs. We follow intently or end up in pain. By walking the flatness or hiking the spikes, we travel in lightness or take serious frights. The incentive is unity and the call proportion. The key is forgiveness and the goal true notion. In wandering wickedness there is never a fruit, but in ample humbleness one encounters the root. Thank you very much for listening. For additional information, the interested audience is referred to the two books, The Fig Tree and the Bell, and The Hypotenuse.